fertilization and pre-implantation diagnosis. He's still a very, very active researcher running the Institute of Reproductive and Developmental Biology at Imperial College. He's written over 300 scientific publications about human reproduction and the early stages of pregnancy. And he's chairman of the Genesis Research Trust, which has raised £30 million to establish an Institute of Reproductive and Developmental Biology, and which funds high quality research into women's health and babies. Since he joined the House of Lords in 1995, Professor Winston has also had a very active role in promoting science in government and politics, and he's had a very active career in broadcasting, making or presenting 17 major series for the BBC, including The Human Body, The Human Mind, Human Instinct, Walking with Cavemen, and The Story of God. Professor Winston came to Cheney in 2017 for the Festival of Ancient and Modern Science, and we're really, really so pleased to welcome him back. He's going to bring our day to a close by giving us his perspective on the future of science and society. Please put questions in the chat at any time, and we'll share them with Professor Winston at the end. Professor Winston, thank you so much for being here. It's really lovely to see you, and over to you.
Well, to tell you the truth, it's lovely to be with you. And actually, my slight annoyance is that I kept a copy, as I keep a copy of all the lectures I give, and I had the copy of the slides that I showed at Cheney some years ago, and I wanted to show one of the slides that I showed then to see what 4 years later had actually happened. Anyway, let me start with my with my medical career. I'm just going to change the lighting slightly because it might be better for you. Hang on a moment. I suspect that might be a slightly less distracting background. I can't see myself on the screen, or can just actually now I can. So I left school without any clear idea what I wanted to do. I mean, I had a place to read natural sciences, and then I didn't really want to wait a gap year. In those days, one didn't wait gap years in the 1950s to go to Cambridge, and I decided that I didn't want to look down a microscope for the rest of my life. So essentially, I didn't take the place up, and then I wondered what I was going to do. And then at the very last minute, without waiting for the gap year, I applied to do medicine, and I got into a medical school and was a terribly bad student, really. But I did qualify, and I had a very good time while I was being a medical student. But it was a very important learning experience. One thing about anything that you do at school, it doesn't. A good thing, not a bad thing. It's rather important, I think, not to be too focused in many ways. In my view, I think keeping your eyes open and your ears open and your senses awake to anything which is interesting is quite important, providing you don't get too distracted. I'm going to talk about persistence, but I don't think that's really critical in this talk, because I've been asked to talk about what it was like in the past medicine. So I'm going to start with a story about a man who came in to the London hospital. I was then a clinical medical student. I suppose I probably would have been about 23, maybe 22. I'd never seen anybody die, and this guy was actually an extremist. He had a very, very serious infection, which was highly contagious. He had various bacteria in his gut, which had paralyzed his gut completely, so-called paralytic ileus, which meant that his gut was not working. And he was dying. Basically, he was just losing fluid from every orifice. He was vomiting and he had diarrhea, and he was in very strict confinement in isolation, on his own, in a sideboard, just a single room. And I was told by the registrar, who was then, of course, my immediate line manager, who was a junior hospital doctor, he said, well, Winston, I'd like you to go in and look after him overnight and keep a record every 15 minutes of his blood pressure and his pulse, and let us know if anything changes. But of course, you do understand that he's not going to survive, and it's very, very important that you are careful not to touch things, that you'll need to wear a mask, and you'll need to wear a gown. In fact, the protective gear was absolutely primitive. I was really quite frightened, and basically I went in there, and the man was semi-conscious. He wasn't able to talk. He was obviously in a very, very critical state. And I recorded faithfully his blood pressure and pulse every 15 minutes. I kept the drip running, and I counted that. And I think I came out of the side room once for about 15 minutes at about 3 o'clock in the morning. They went back in again. And the following morning at around breakfast time, not that I felt like any breakfast, this guy was still alive. And I left to go back to my room where I had a sleep. And then I thought about him during the day and I wondered what was happening. So I went back to the ward and found that he was still lying there, but now unconscious. And they still needed somebody to look after him during the night. They were very short of nurses. So I volunteered very, very reluctantly to go back into that room. And I started my watch at 10 o'clock at night and sat with him, recording his blood pressure and pulse. They'd tried a various number of antibiotics that didn't work. He had drug-resistant bacteria in his gut. Basically, the experimental antibiotic they had tried wasn't working. And he was clearly really on the way out. And about 2:30, I took his blood pressure. That was sort of, I don't know, probably about 4 hours before dawn. And oddly, his blood pressure had stopped dropping. It would remain static for about half an hour, and his pulse rate had slowed down a bit, which was rather surprising. And he was still unconscious. Anyway, I sat there, and then by morning, there were some slight signs that his blood pressure was recovering and his pulse was recovering. And it really looked as if he was going to be, at least, if not dying, he might survive. He didn't seem to have total organ failure. He still was passing urine through the catheter, which was inserted. And I went off, and it turned out that 24 hours later, he was better. In fact, basically, the antibiotics that they'd given, the experimental antibiotics, worked, and he started to recover. Being a young man in his late 30s, he recovered pretty rapidly. And no less than 7 days later, he actually walked out of hospital, staggered out a bit, really, but he staggered out of hospital really quite fit. And of course, the team were delighted because, of course, there they were taking credit for this fantastic achievement, this new antibiotic, a new treatment for ileus. And look, they must publish it in a journal. And they did publish it in a journal. Of course, needless to say, my name was not on that paper that they published. But as he passed out through the door of the ward, I saw him and went up to him. And he said to me, "I remember you very well. You sat with me last night, that last night, when everybody thought I was dying, and in fact the night before. And I knew that you were with me the whole time, even though I didn't speak to you. And I just want to thank you for what you did." And he walked out. So I didn't get my name on the paper, but actually I got that extraordinary message from him. And it was deeply moving because, of course, I was terrified. I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to touch him. I had no, it was hardly altruistic. I was doing basically what I was told, really quite reluctantly. But it is extraordinary to consider that one of the great things about doing medicine and science is that you do things for other people in a way which few people seldom have that privilege. And the things that you do have long-lasting effect. It's fair to say that if you become a doctor, for example, 40 years, long after you've forgotten who that person was, they will remember you. Now, of course, nowadays, of course, we have intensive care. We didn't have anything like that in the 1960s. So this was a very, very crude last-ditch sort of stand. But of course, it was interesting because it now, I reflect that now, of course, young people, my colleagues now, some of my juniors who work with me scientifically, I don't work clinically anymore. They've been working at the front line in that kind of situation, day after day, month after month, feeling deeply challenged by what they were doing and watching people die all the time. And so the plague has been terrifying. There's no question the coronavirus has been terrifying. And I've no doubt that most of you who are there today celebrating this wonderful festival have been very frightened and often very depressed about it. I want to tell you something that you don't hear enough. It is an amazing opportunity. Just as that occasion with that patient in the 1960s was an astonishing a moment for me. It was a moment of opportunity. It's something I've never forgotten. And of course, it's something from which I learned and something which actually made me understand that even if somebody seems to be unconscious, you've got to treat them with huge respect, and you mustn't actually, in fact, say things which they might hear or their brain might perceive, even though they don't seem to be able to hear you or respond to you. And certainly we now know scientifically, of course, that even when people are deeply comatose, the brain often is functioning remarkably well. And certainly Adrian Owen at Cambridge showed that with his wonderful experiments some years ago using magnetic resonance imaging, one of the great advances in medicine. But I think it's fair to say, of course, that people with the virus now, one of the things that's really quite terrifying to think about is that they've been dying completely unaccompanied. They couldn't even see their nearest and dearest. This man, of course, didn't have any local relatives who could come to see him anyway. But nowadays, of course, people have been completely excluded because we're so terrified of the infection. But the fact of the matter is that what has happened this year, in this last year, is absolutely mind-boggling. When I was a medical student doing immunology, we understood about blood groups. We knew there were white cells. We knew there were such things as phagocytes, which in fact ingested material which might be bits of cells or stuff that shouldn't be in the bloodstream, and basically was a kind of policeman which kept the bloodstream reasonably clean. But we had no idea of the intricacies of now what is one of the most scientific subjects in the whole of medicine, immunology. In fact, this year we've learned more about immunology, I think, than ever at any time in our past, going right back to the time of Louis Pasteur in the mid-19th century. And of course, it was Pasteur who was one of the first people to produce a vaccine. He wasn't the first, of course. The first was Edward Jenner in the 1770s, 1780s, when he produced a modified virus, cowpox, which in fact he inoculated a cow girl with, and of course that in fact prevented people getting cowpox, smallpox. He noticed people who had been tending cows and got the sort of vesicles from that cowpox never got the smallpox, or seldom got the smallpox. If they didn't get a very serious infection. Of course, smallpox was a much more terrifying disease than coronavirus, because it was even more infectious than the coronaviruses, and it killed millions of people worldwide. However, I mean, since then, it's taken usually about 12, 15 years to produce new vaccines. You know, we're still looking for good vaccines for things like HIV, though that's coming on. And it's a long time now since we had the first cases. And yet, with this year, we've developed vaccines which are remarkably effective and really pretty safe at a very high level, which don't seem to have on the whole side effects which aren't completely controllable, and which don't cause any particular difficulty when you inject them. And we have produced an astonishing regression of the infection rate and the death rate as a result. Now, that's unprecedented in medical history, and it shows what can be done. It's been done partly, of course, by something which is quite unusual. It's not been manufacturing, and it's not been industry, and it's not been universities. It's a collaboration between universities and industry. It's almost unique. That has not happened in general in medical advances. It's something which I think from which we should learn. And so one of the reasons why, in fact, you might want to consider doing any kind of science at university is because actually you will be inevitably contributing to that kind of collaboration in due course. Now, it has to be said that it's not just the vaccine development. We've learned not only about the immune system, but we've learned much more about the physiology of the heart. We've understood the physiology of the kidney. We've now identified new aspects of kidney disease we didn't know. We have been completely bowled over by the fact we can now see certain things in the central nervous system we hadn't expected and never understood. And we're beginning to see how, in fact, different ways of attacking a virus like this in a pandemic is so possible, in extraordinarily so. And of course, one of the things, of course, that happened worldwide, we completely ignored history. When I came to Cheney back in 2017, and I showed the slide which demonstrated there were 10 threats, I think, in medicine just generally that we were dealing with, one of which was climate change and one of which was water supply. But on there, very firmly, was the word pandemic. And it's interesting to consider, of course, that nobody took that notice at all. We didn't consider history, but of course we should have done, because there have been three great pandemics in the world, and of course multiple smaller pandemics at continuous times ever since humans first became civilized. The thing, of course, which started the pandemics off was the building of cities. We have good evidence from archaeology that from about 6,000 years earlier, we've actually had this problem of recurrent infection because people are living close together, often with poor water supplies, and particularly with poverty. That's been one of the big problems. The lack of decent infrastructure has made a massive difference. And actually, when we consider all the medical advances, one of the biggest problems we still have in our society is nothing to do with science or medicine. It's to do with the infrastructure. It's to do with stable government. It's to do with wise decisions. It's to do, above all, with malnutrition and poverty and the environment, because, of course, that actually has been a massive killer, as it has, of course, during this pandemic. And it's interesting to note, of course, that far more people who are not very well off have suffered much worse than people who've been better off. When you look at the three great pandemics, the plague of Justinian in 541, it lasted for 9 years, and it kept on coming back again and again, gradually attenuating. The next big plague was 1347, and of course that started in Asia, just as the pandemic started in Asia as well. The first pandemic started in Asia, and indeed the third big pandemic was 1850, and they all have a very similar pattern. The epicenter is usually from very, very impoverished people, and usually, of course, comes as a result of travel. In 1347, there's no question the big problem was shipping, crossing the Mediterranean, and it spread through Europe. Now, of course, it's aeroplanes, and that's why, of course, shutting one's borders absolutely makes sense during a pandemic. But unfortunately, that's led to all sorts of difficult issues. And one of the problems, of course, is that science is done at its best by collaboration. Indeed, human affairs are done by collaboration. We don't succeed as unique geniuses. There are a few unique geniuses, of course. We think of Beethoven perhaps sitting in his little room with a broken piano going deaf, writing his last great string quartets on his own, and completely isolated, and actually drunk most of the time as well. He was quite severely alcoholic, and his liver was certainly not functioning properly, and very, very bad-tempered, and deeply unhappy most of the time, and yet with that sublime genius. But most of us who are creative, nearly all of us, are not that clever, not that geniuses. You and I, there may be one or two of you, certainly I wouldn't be amongst that lot who are really very bright. I'm certainly not. Basically, most of us, the difference in intelligence is not very great. But what we do have, of course, in our society is massive differences in the environment. And that's why being in a good school like Cheney, for example, near Oxford, and actually having the advantages of the good environment that the school provides you is a huge advantage to you, just as, of course, a good education is everywhere. But it's but so many people are deprived from that from the very, very start. So that's something I think we need to be thinking about in our aspects. So collaboration and thinking about other people is critical. I think the next thing that I want to suggest to you is this, that it was mentioned that I published 300 publications, which sounds very grand. I must tell you that I'm certainly not a grand scientist. Actually, most of those publications, most of the 300 publications, all were printed, of course, in a journal as a result of an experiment, and most of them represent a failure. Because, of course, in order to succeed, you have to fail first, and you have to try again and again to get it to work. So actually, those publications represent signal failures, but actually perhaps the sense to carry on persisting to see why it failed and what you could do to improve it. Of course, there are times when giving up is right, but very often not giving up is probably more important. And of course, in my group, when it was at its highest, when we had the Institute first funded in 1990, I had about 100 scientists around me in that group. And I can tell you, quite frankly, I was certainly nothing like the most prolific or the most respected or the best scientist in the group. I wasn't. I was really quite ordinary, but perhaps what I did have was the ability to get people interested and to help them to find ways of helping each other. So how we collaborate is of huge importance in our lives. And that is a real problem today. This week, we've seen yet again the problem that is so screaming at us. We can't solve the problems of the pandemic without global collaboration. We can't solve the problems of climate change without global collaboration. Those things are absolutely essential. We actually have to really understand other people, and we have to help people across the world. So it is bitterly disappointing that we have this quarrel with Europe, for example, about the release of vaccines, which were sometimes as a result of research done in this country, but which we can't in fact get access to because they're refusing, or they have been refusing, to export them. That sort of quarrel is completely unacceptable. And of course, we're partly responsible for that as well. Our behavior has not been brilliant in Europe, but I think we have to understand that we really do have to work together. And if we don't, then of course, even out of self-interest, things will collapse. I don't have any doubt, though, that the effect of the pandemic has been so great that it will have a positive effect also on how we behave towards each other. And I think that means that we will start to understand the humanities and value our arts a great deal more than we have done. Thank goodness for that too, because it seems to me that they've been a great strength for us, even though, of course, we couldn't watch performing arts, we couldn't hear performing arts during the pandemic. We no doubt will start to value them very much again. The last thing I want to suggest to you before I take any questions is that it seems to me that one of the things the pandemic really should have done for us, and I think it probably has, I hope it does, and I hope you will consider that, is the idea of having ethical standards, of understanding that really there is such a thing as of justice. I don't mean justice in a law court, but I mean justice of understanding other people, of respecting other people, and learning, in fact, that other people we can't live without other people, and we need to collaborate in that very intimate way as well. One of the great sadnesses for me of the pandemic is that I'm talking to you on this ridiculous podium through a computer screen. It's not something I enjoy doing, because I would far rather stand in front of you and communicate with you face to face, because of course communication, human communication, depends on body language, it depends on pitch, it depends on all sorts of issues, humor, and it's very difficult to do that kind of thing on a cold computer screen. And moreover, of course, I've no idea whether any of you are watching me by now. You might have just got fed up and moved off, because of course I can't see you. You can see my face, hopefully, but I don't know if you can. But there we are. So to my mind, that eye contact, that face contact, that body contact is really one of the critical issues in our society. And we need to find ways of getting around to that. In Parliament, of course, we've become, in the House of Lords, completely working in remotely. And of course, in terms of serious debate, it is absolutely crippling. I must say, I think the Parliament now, of course, has almost become a fraction of what it was. It has very little ability to hold the key players in the government to account. It's much more difficult when you don't actually have face-to-face contact and when you can't go and see people. And I think that that's one of the issues that, although many parliamentarians are hoping to continue remote virtual parliament after the lockdown's finished, in my view, the sooner we get back to proper debate and proper face-to-face contact, that will be of great benefit to human affairs. And actually, the idea of holding the administration to account from time to time is something which is really very critical. I suppose one of the good things about the House of Lords, at least, is that it's not very political, and on the whole, rational argument tries to hold sway. But it's not been that easy. Of course, when in fact, given a debate, you don't have a minister who needs to really answer you because you can move on, simply because everything is so truncated and there is so much work to do on a virtual screen, which means that you can actually avoid answering questions. It's been a big problem for parliamentarians. And I think that that's going to be a big problem for science too. So to my mind, that collaboration is something which we should really celebrate. So what else can I say to you? I had intended to show you some slides, and I will describe just one slide that I was going to show you, which is an amazing video of Leonard Bernstein, the conductor, conducting the Berliner Philharmonic many years ago. And he's conducting the last movement of Haydn's 88th Symphony. And the orchestra are playing absolutely impeccably. It's a brilliant performance. And Leonard Bernstein is simply, he's put his baton under his arm. He's not waving his arms around. He's just looking at the orchestra and just watching them and moving his lips, moving his eyebrows, moving his facial muscles, moving his chin, occasionally his shoulders, once or twice moving a foot, but he's not conducting. What he's doing, of course, is the finest form of collaboration. And I think that is an example of actually how communication has to be. Communication for all of us is going to be very, very important in the future. What will medicine look like in the future? I've no idea. But I know that some of the things that we tend to boast about are very unwisely boasted about. I think one of the great things that we need to achieve is one of those traditional values, which actually is being a bit more modest. I think we understand, at least as a result of the pandemic, that we are extremely fragile. We are not all perfect. We're not all formidably powerful. And actually, we are liable to live with uncertainty. Uncertainty is a very important property. Don't be frightened of uncertainty. Uncertainty is actually what makes us do science. In some cases, it's what makes us do religion. In some cases, it's what makes us do something which actually helps other people because we're really uncertain. And I think certainty is often much more dangerous. So don't pray for certainty, because actually, in the long term, it isn't good for any of us. I've said enough. Let me answer some questions.
Professor Winston, thank you very, very much. If you'd all, whichever of the two assemblies you're on, could you please put your questions in the chat now, and I will read them out. I'll just give you a minute or two to do that. Professor Winston, thanks so much for giving us some sort of principles really to think about as we go forward from this difficult situation and start to sort of imagine the uncertain future. Sorry, I was muted in the other group. Could you please pop your questions in the chat now, and in a couple of minutes I'll pose those to Professor Winston. President, thank you so much. I'll just pause for a moment to allow people to compose their thoughts and to write some things in.
No questions?
Sorry, I've got one question here, which is what did you think about Boris Johnson's statement that the vaccine development was boosted by greed?
Sorry, the vaccine development was what by greed?
Was boosted by greed, was encouraged by greed.
I think it's complete rubbish, but I think quite often, you know, we're used to politicians speaking rubbish, even those that we vote for sometimes. I don't think, if I'm very, very honest, and of course I don't wish to speak politically, but I don't think the Prime Minister's covered himself with glory with that. He's constantly contradicting himself. For example, you know, he's been boasting that he's going to make Britain into the leading science superpower, and of course has just cut £2 billion off the budget this week, or at least that's what's threatened. So is it boosted by greed? No. I think what is remarkable, of course, is that the people working on the vaccines so often did this altruistically and for free, and that's been happening with a number of the vaccines which developed. And there's no question that the companies like AstraZeneca and GKN and all the others, GSK and all the others, Pfizer, have actually been primarily concerned about the human need. And when you meet those people, and after all, I've worked with Pfizer and I've worked with AstraZeneca in different capacities, purely scientifically. So I know some of the people. You would not say that they were greedy. They are in that industry primarily because they think it's of value. And actually, what is rather sad is that, you know, a conservative prime minister could use that phrase, but of course he knows perfectly well that for an industry has to have shareholders in a capitalist system and must make a profit. It has to be available for the profit, but that profit has to be proportionate. And I think on the whole it has been. It's not been disproportionate, and I think that the most vaccines are not in fact money spinners. They don't make a profit. One of the problems why we've not actually had good vaccines in the past, because if you make a vaccine, you can't make a profit from it, because you've got to give it to lots of normal people. It's not people who are ill who have vaccines. It's people who might become ill. So it's a preventative medicine, and preventative medicine is not particularly valuable to the individual who deals with it.
Thank you very, very much. I've got a next question, which is a very open question. But is there a particular book you've hugely enjoyed, or which you'd like to recommend, whether from reading a long time ago or something you've read recently?
Well, the book I've just finished reading, which I'd never read before, I've just finished it yesterday, so that will do, won't it? And you're not going to like this, but I deeply feel we've stopped reading really good literature. I've just finished Bleak House by Charles Dickens. It's a brilliant novel, and it's about 1,000 pages. It's very long. It's overwritten. It's very complex plot, but Charles Dickens actually is much underrated in a modern society because he's very funny. He's very satirical. He makes fun, in this case, of lawyers. I mean, the whole book is around a failed law case, John Dice Francis John Dice, who in fact ends up spending the entire estate of wills that have been left in a bequest on the legal fees. But it's about a love story. It's about a murder mystery. It's about people living in absolute poverty in the centre of London, and it's about how very well-off people behave, sometimes indifferently. And above all, he's a brilliant judge of character. Charles Dickens is one of the great British writers, and unfortunately now we've stopped reading those people. And I think it's a great pity, because we should be going back to look at the classics, because there's a lot in them. And it might be worth just trying Bleak House, but just realize that you have to work at it for quite a while before it suddenly becomes very interesting indeed, and extremely funny.
Thank you very much. There's another sort of general question here. Is what would you say is the most important for the future of human development? I mean, you've referenced collaboration already as the most important thing. Is there what else might you say is most important for human development?
Education. There's no question, of course, that if we're going to really have a proper society and a responsible society, we have to recognize that the environment in which we bring people up is absolutely critical. And one of the problems about our society is we do not value education, and we don't value teachers. In my view, education is the most valuable commodity we actually have. And we should be greedy, by the way, for education. Sadly, in fact, governments are not greedy for education. They are simplistic about education. Quite often what they want to do is to sort of have almost competitive results, rather than actually thinking about how people... Learning facts is all very well, but I think learning about things in a wider context is critically important, and I personally feel that that's what I mean by education.
Thank you very much. The next question is about your work in fertility, and has that developed a certain view? Perhaps I could put this sort of most widely on sort of the law and the law and reproduction.
Well, the work I'm doing at the moment, I'm really... It's very intriguing. Of course, everything, your last idea is always your best idea, and and the one you're doing at the moment is always the most thing that's interesting. But for years, I've been working with a young woman called Sheba Jarvis, who was one of my students. She worked in my lab as a student for a while. She then did her doctorate in my laboratory, and now she is, in fact, she's now a postdoc, so she's quite senior. And she and I have been working on how embryos metabolize. It turns out that in vitro fertilization is still very, very unsuccessful. We think we've hit on potential markers which could tell us whether the embryo 2 or 3 days after fertilization is healthy or not. If we're right, this is of huge importance because it would greatly improve IVF. It would be of use worldwide because infertility is one of the most savage problems that people actually face on a personal level. And of course, it's worth quite a lot of money. So we've patented it. Now, let me say we've patented what we're doing. This is not in any way out of greed. Why we're patenting it is so, in fact, it can be released under license to anybody who wants to use it responsibly. And the idea, of course, is that if you patent something, you have more control over how it's used, and you have control against the private market. So our hope is that that's what we'll do. Now, what's interesting, this work also involves a couple of other scientists as well. So the 4 of us working together. None of us are interested in making any kind of profit from this. What we want to see is that area of medicine being approved and improved. And I think that, this is not an unusual behavior. I think we forget that there are all sorts of reasons why people want to protect their intellectual property, which are not simply greed. It's often simply very sensible to do that.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Winston. I apologise if there's been a slight echo for
You've gone quiet.
I'm sorry. I went quiet because I'm trying to ensure that I don't appear echoing on either of the assemblies.
Yes.
We've just got a sort of a couple more minutes. Could I possibly put a question, which is how has science turned out differently to what you perhaps might have expected when you were a young doctor or a young researcher in the 1960s and 1970s? How have things been sort of different to what people might have been thinking about the future?
Well, I think one of the things that is very different, when I started as a very young scientist, I did work largely on my own, and I was not collaborating with other people because, in fact, I was working in a small group. But as science has got more interdigitated, now, for example, we're not just biologists or chemists or physicists or mathematicians. In fact, nowadays, you have to understand physics, chemistry, maths if you're doing science, even though, of course, you may be a biologist and not have those qualifications. So you need to be collaborating with more and more people. So, for example, this project that I'm doing with the embryo metabolism, the most important person in this project actually is the mathematician who can work out how we use the data more effectively to get the results that we need to have to tell us whether we're doing something which is useful or not. And so that's a skill that was never even thought about 20 or 30 years ago, how you handle data, and in fact big data, because of course each embryo that we study will produce 2,000 or 3,000 data points, and when you've got several hundred embryos you're looking at in different populations, it becomes extremely complex. And this is not something a biologist can handle. It's something you need to have somebody who's professionally able to look at those data. So I think that that's changed very much. I also think that there is another difference in science, and I think I've been involved with that to quite a large extent. When I started doing science, people who communicated science were not taken very seriously. In fact, communicating science wasn't regarded as being a good thing to do. Scientists were rather aloof. They thought of themselves as rather controlling things. It was somewhat elitist, and that has completely changed now. Now I think scientists are very ready to communicate, and I think that communication is absolutely essential, because a key aspect of what we do is this: that the science that I do in my laboratory is not my science. It's everybody's science. I do it basically with other people's money. I do it in a university which is funded by a lot of people. I do it in a society which relies on those taxes. And I have to ensure that science is therefore promulgated. And you can't promulgate something for which you don't take responsibility. And you can't, in fact, you can't really promulgate something which you don't communicate properly. So we have a duty to communicate what we're doing. We have a duty to consider the upside and the downside, the side effects and the advantages, and the cost. And I think that's something which has changed much more in science than ever before. It certainly was not true in the Victorian period. And I don't think it was true when I first started science after the Second World War.
Professor Winston, thank you so much. You've given us such a wide-ranging picture there of the quality of collaboration that we need to be working towards if we're to solve the kind of problems we've been looking at today. The amazing range of changes that have taken place in science and medicine, and also I think really made us think about science and medicine as vocations and things that we can do in accordance with certain sort of very grounded principles as part of a wider society where we ask questions and enjoy the humanities and the arts, as I hope we'll all be able to do this summer. I really hope that you'll be able to come back. We really are very much sort of looking forward to welcoming you back to speak to us in person at Cheney at some point in the future. We're very hopeful that will happen. But thank you very much for reflecting on the pandemic with us, on the very difficult experience that we've collectively been through, and the role of science and medicine in dealing with that, and pointing us towards an uncertain but hopefully a very optimistic and positive future. So it's been wonderful that you've been able to join us today, and we hope that you'll, like everyone else, you'll be able to sort of enjoy more of the sunshine and more of the gradual opening up, which we're expecting to have thanks to the amazing work of the vaccine teams and all of the people who've been working to keep us safe. So thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much to all of the Cheney community in Year 12 and Year 11 for taking part today. We've had a really good day, and we're looking forward so much to seeing your ideas on the ideas wall. And as you know, on the 23rd of April, Mr. Pavey, the head teacher, will be feeding back on all the ideas that you've come up with and thinking about the kind of things we may be able to do in the future here at Cheney. So thank you very much, Professor Winston. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a really great afternoon. Don't forget the ideas wall. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I look forward to visiting Headington in due course. All the very best to you.